Welcome everyone to the beginning of this, what we hope will be a webinar series. We'll see if we keep the technology, given the fact that I keep cutting out. But our webinar series is Metals Meet MEPs, and we're going to have a series of discussions with you, the metals industry, and it's great to see so many of you dialing in from around Europe. The benefit of modern technology being that we can have more of you in the room. Between MEPs and some of our key industry actors on some of the topics that are affecting the industry going forward, and indeed a part of Europe's future. We did start this debate back in Strasbourg, which feels a long time ago, with the metals industry, talking about metals with ambition and the contribution of the metals sector to some of those key European goals. But of course, in the intervening period, quite a lot has happened in the world. So I suppose the first thing to say is I hope that everyone watching in is safe and well, and their families are also safe and well. Today, the topic for our debate is industrial policy, what's needed to restart the European metals industry post-COVID-19. And there's a few elements to that I'll just pick up on before I introduce our speakers. So clearly back in March, again, feels like a long time ago, the Commission put out its industrial policy strategy paper, and I know that Eurometaux and the metals industry generally put out its response, and industrial policy was clearly seen as a key part of the European Green Deal. So if we think about what has been put out by the Commission since the von der Leyen Commission came in, I think the interesting thing has been that environment has been seen and the Green Deal is seen as an industrial policy as much as an environmental policy. But of course, COVID-19 has seemingly brought much of that economy to a halt and perhaps questioned the direction of travel that we're going along. So today we're going to talk and hear from our industry actors and our MEP friends about the short-term impact that COVID-19 has been having both on the industry and in terms of the policies that might be needed to respond to that, but also taking a longer term view about how COVID-19 is affecting the way we might look at some of those things we were already talking about in terms of industrial policy, whether they be trade elements, strategic raw materials, or indeed some of those big ambitious climate goals that the EU is setting itself. So to help us in that discussion, we have four panelists, two from industry and two from the European Parliament. So it's a welcome to Javier Targhetta, who's the CEO of Atlantic Copper, currently sat in Madrid, and clearly an organisation that has been affected. Is going to talk us through how the operations down there that he has in the south of Spain, in Huelva, have been affected. I'm guessing both from in terms of the day-to-day operations, but also the issues around supply and indeed demand for copper as a result of the crisis. We've also got Egil Hogna, who's Executive Vice President at Extruded Solutions at Hydro, and clearly very interesting to hear from Egil, and welcome Egil to the call. Given Hydro being a vertically integrated metals company, everything all the way from the upstream all the way to the downstream, and of course with operations throughout Europe. So I think interesting to hear how this crisis is affecting not only the kind of integrated nature of our metals chain, lots of people on the call from different parts of it, but also how it's affecting different parts of Europe. We're also joined by two MEP guests. Many of you will know them both. Anna-Michelle ASIMAKOPOULOU, who's a Greek EPP member, joining us from Greece today. A pleasure, Anna-Michelle, to have you with us. We of course heard from Anna-Michelle in our panel down in Strasbourg earlier this year on trade aspects. She's of course the Vice Chair of the International Trade Committee, very prominent member of the Parliament already, and I know with some very interesting, strong views on many of the issues we're going to discuss today. And we're delighted to have Tom Berendsen here with us from the Netherlands EPP, a member of the Industry Committee itself, also heavily involved in the EPP's views, a shadow on the forthcoming view of the Parliament on the Commission's recent industrial policy. So we're happy, Tom, to have you joining us and giving us perhaps a view from the north of Europe to match the one from the south. So with that in mind, I have just a couple of housekeeping things to do. We're going to have some interventions from our panelists, and then we're going to hopefully engage in a bit of debate. And you have a chance, dear audience, to engage in that debate too. So you have a chance to ask questions via the chat, which colleagues off screen will be collating and giving to me. So you have an opportunity to ask a question to any of the panelists and interject into the debate via the chat function. We've also already launched a poll which reads, are you confident that COVID-19 recovery plans currently discussed at EU level are on the right track for keeping the European metals industry viable? Question mark. You can have a go at the poll, and after the initial interventions, we'll take the result of the poll and discuss it together. So with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to, first of all, to Javier. Javier, welcome. Perhaps an interesting
point. James.
Spain's been one of the most affected countries from COVID, and I know you're under perhaps one of the most severe lockdowns of any European country. So we're kind of interested to hear how you're doing, but also how Atlantic Copper's doing, and how you see things evolving. Javier, over to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, James. Well, first of all, I very much appreciate this opportunity to be part of this panel. I think it is more than ever very essential, the joint work between the public and the private sector. We've been very fortunate, James, in weathering the storm so far. Well, family-wise, fortunately, I haven't had any case, so no problem at all. And we started the work from home for all those who could work from home, more or less 35% of our payroll. And it was, we took the measure 1 week in advance of so by the beginning of March, 1 week in advance of the official lockdown. And a few days later, when the lockdown for the industry was became mandatory, we were elected as one of the essential sectors for both our production of copper, which is a very essential material in the supply chain of food industry, of chemicals, of materials that are essential for sanitary appliances. So we were also fortunate that precisely Huelva is the lowest case rate province in Spain, very limited, and we have had just one case out of 1,000 people between our own employees and our contractors. And that case was someone who got the contagion in a trip outside Huelva. So it was, he never came back to work, and it was more than a month ago. He is doing well and he's fully recovered. So we have no case, and working at full speed. We've been working like that all the time. Of course, we've been facing problems both at the supply side of copper concentrates. There have been mines that were shut down across the pond because of the pandemic. In some cases, because of they had maybe too many cases, and they made that decision to shut it down, to shut down the mine. In other cases, it's been more for prevention reasons, like it was in mines in Peru. But we've been able to replace the cargoes that were supposed to be coming from those mines from other origins. So, like I said, so far so good, and we don't anticipate any supply problems for the remaining part of the year. We're very happy with that. Regarding our sales, our main two products is copper and sulfuric acid, and we've been able to place everything we've been producing well. There's been a decline in the copper market in Spain of around 30%, but we've been able to replace those sales by exports to our usual markets outside Spain, such as Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and for those sales which we couldn't, for those part of our sales that we couldn't place in Spain, we've been able to sell to traders, and so we are not facing a problem at all. Regarding sulfuric acid, it's been probably better. We sell almost all over the world, and of course there's been disruptions. It's a rather narrow market. The overseas market is a narrow one, and but we've been able to cover all our sales into chartered vessels and to place our material as we wanted. So now, regarding, and I think you wanted us also to outline what our wishes would be, or what our plans would be to start the recovery of our economy, of our industry. And I would say it again that in my opinion, it is absolutely crucial, the public and private sector joint work. And in terms of specific measure, well, first of all, of course, we've got to ensure the health and the safety of our employees, of our people, and do everything with healthy practices like limitation of movement, social distancing, indoor and outdoor, at work and at leisure, using PPEs, facilitation of massive testing. And this is very much a responsibility of our governments, and obviously send home any employee who simply would not feel well. And regarding the economic recovery, there should be, in my opinion, immediate economic measures, such as providing massive recovery package with MFF funds in Euro bonds, issuance aimed at financing investment in public infrastructure that at the same time could be or will be consistent with the Green Deal, such as short distance trains and hydraulic infrastructure, housing renovation, a plan to recover demand at the automotive industry sector, including recharge stations for EVs, an industrial investment incentive plan to increase the industrial sector competitiveness, and with special focus on sustainability and circular economy projects, by providing long-term loans at zero interest rates and significant non-refundable percentages depending on the project's nature. Reinforcement to competitiveness by eliminating power generation tax, and providing funds for the compensation of the indirect CO2 costs. Fostering international trade by increasing foreign transactions coverage insurance. Keep on promoting innovation, and again, public and private sector joint work. We've been very happy with the EIP, and we are part of the KIC raw material, very successfully completed a number of projects, and aiming at new ones with collaboration with European universities and other industry players. Then I would, as a specific measure, a 6-month moratorium on VAT, corporate tax, social security charges, especially for SMEs. And finally, long term, starting now, perhaps a new raw materials initiative fostering exploration and exploitation of mineral resources, recycling industries, and whenever, in the absence and lack of availability of these previous ones, strengthen access to materials from other areas of the world, not limited to secondary materials, scrap, and the like, So I think the EIP is a success story, like it was many more years ago. IPPC.
Yeah. Javier,
encourage both sectors to work together.
Javier, thank you for those comments. Can you guys still hear me? I hear I'm cutting in and out, so do wave if I'm missing. But Javier, thanks for that introduction from your perspective. Glad to hear that, at least from your in terms of your plant, things are still operational. Things that struck me from what you said, clearly, actually, one factor that I know we're going to come on to in the discussion, I'm sure Anna Michelle's going to bring in, is that global factor there. And I think we heard, I was thinking of you very much clearly in terms of your Spanish operations, but you mentioned very clearly there that both in terms of your supply, but also in terms of your customers, you're part of a global chain. It seems not only a European chain, but a global chain, and those are good impacts. I was also interested, and that's probably a segue into Egil's 5 minutes, is in terms of some of those measures on the demand side to get demand going again. I think there you picked up Javier, and we've been reading, I think, articles about, how do we relaunch the renovation? How do we get the renovation wave going to get built? How do we get, your EV infrastructure in cars? Do we do something to get the automotive sector going again? Lots of it strikes me kind of key down of the sector. I'm guessing, Egil, that some of that's going to play into what you're going to tell us about how you've been affected, but how you'd also like to see the restart happen. Egil, your 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, James. I will definitely talk about that, but I'd like to start with giving you a quick overview of the impact the COVID-19 has had on my company, Norsk Hydro. And like you mentioned, James, we are a vertically integrated aluminium company, going all the way from the bauxite mine through the alumina refining, the aluminium smelting, the casting into semis, and then finally products like extrusions and sheet and foil, which are then being finally put into windows, doors, car parts, machines, lighting, and so on. Our strategy from the beginning has been to take care of the health and safety of our employees and the local communities where we operate as a #1 priority. The second priority, but also a very important one, has been to keep the wheels turning, because we are part of many critical value chains and ecosystems in the different parts of industry in Europe. The people impact on my organization so far, which consists of 35,000 employees, is that we currently have 10 active infections with the virus, and we have 50 people who are fully recovered. We don't have any hospitalizations, and we are happy that none of our employees have had severe symptoms from the virus. In terms of the production impact, the impact we are seeing so far is mainly downstream. And the reason for this is that the main impact is related to the missing demand. At this stage, 15% of our downstream plants, we have about 100, are either fully closed or running at critically low levels. About 55% are running at significantly reduced levels, and about 30% are running approximately normal, defined as plan or 10% below plan. For our people, and now I'm talking about the 22,000 in the downstream part, approximately 1/3 of them are either temporarily laid off or working less than normal, either through the short working schemes or the forced vacation system. However, upstream is still running almost as normal, but we are building inventory, and my greatest concern right now is that we are going to have the impact upstream sooner or later, because when downstream demand goes missing, it's only a question of time before the upstream part of the value chain is hit. For our company, this is the most serious, because in the aluminium industry, starting and stopping aluminium smelters is incredibly costly. You need to take out liquid metal, and a starting and stopping operation is often simply not possible, also because of electricity contracts not allowing us to do so. But anyway, when we do it, the cost per smelter is usually a double-digit million euro cost. And this can have devastating consequences. So I then like to move on to what can we do to stimulate demand, and specifically what can the European Union do? Well, as the main challenge is demand, we believe the most important thing is to create confidence in the future rather than fear. And I'd like to mention that when I look at Europe today, there is a significant difference between the demand in different countries. We are seeing that the countries where the virus has clearly been out of control, where the national health services have been overloaded with cases, and in many ways you could say have lost control, this is where we see the least confidence in the future and the lowest levels of demand. To put it very simple, we see lower levels of demand in the south of Europe compared to the north of Europe, where, for example, Scandinavia and Germany have almost normal levels of demand, with the Benelux somewhere in the middle, and several of the countries in the south, in particular the southwest, are having still very low levels of demand. It is also important to take credible and relevant action. And we think the initial establishment of the so-called green lanes, which the EU did early in the crisis, was a very important action and a very successful one. However, the most important action right now is simply to control the virus so that people regain trust in the healthcare system. Then it's about committing to investment supporting jobs and the economy. And here, of course, consistency between words and action is really important, because if we're not able to do that, then again, credibility can be lost. Green investments based on clear sustainability criteria would be perfect for the European industry, because we typically have lower emissions than the rest of the world. We have, for example, low carbon aluminium based on hydropower, and we also have aluminium based on a minimum 75% of post-consumer scrap, the lowest carbon footprint possible in the aluminium industry today. Other immediate measures we believe is to have a strong focus on Europe, because we need to preserve and rebuild European jobs and industry. That means, for example, strong measures against dumping and unfair subsidies, which we have seen quite a bit of, for example, coming from China. Another issue which we see in China now is that the Chinese government has taken the initiative to build aluminium stocks, so-called strategic stocks. This is something which we, to a certain extent, understand, but it makes us very much concerned. This is high carbon production of aluminium. It is good for the Chinese smelters because it means they don't have to stop, but it can become a threat to Europe. Cheap, high carbon imports may actually in turn force European closures. And we remember very well the financial crisis in 2008-2009. After that crisis, approximately 1/3 of the European primary aluminium capacity was permanently closed. And today China has 60% of the global market. 15 years ago, they had only 15%, 1/5, and now they have 60. If we play it wrongly now, the rest of the European primary aluminium industry could actually be lost. And we know that this can happen because it has happened to the magnesium industry, for example, which is now today completely eliminated in Europe. And we believe that authorities now should evaluate to also do some European stockpiling of primary aluminium in order to prevent the closures of smelters, because that might be, the consequence might be that they will not come up again.
Okay.
If an action like this would be taken, it would smoothen out economic activity, reduce job losses, and also the permanent loss of business.
Thanks, Egil.
Finally, in terms of some medium-term measures, we believe further stimulate the market and demand for green and sustainable products. Car scrappage schemes, e-mobility schemes, VAT reductions and incentives for green buildings are examples of that. More fundamental measures like carbon leakage protection by improving the indirect CO2 compensation would be effective, and of course making sure we have competitive energy costs.
Egil, thanks for those comments. And I think, I mean, just the beginning of your comments, which I thought was really interesting from those of us who don't work in the aluminium sector, the comment you made, there's a lot of talk in this town, I think, around restarting. And I think that the point you made about the smelters, that kind of it's not something that you can just simply stop and then start again, right? That if they were to close down, is a kind of, you can, is a really interesting point. I think there's a kind of discourse at the moment around, you know, you can start as quickly as you stopped almost. And it seems to me from what you said that there are some challenges to that. Equally, I'm sure Anna Michelle's going to pick up upon this, the kind of importance of the putting Europe first in this and making sure that we restart the economy and we look after the European industry in that process of recovery, particularly given what's going on in the rest of the world. And you mentioned China and what they might be doing is I think interesting. And some very concrete ideas. One about you mentioned the inventories on the primary side, potentially building. You know, what do we do with those inventories, and do we kind of need a European way of stockpiling and absorbing some of that capacity, at least in the short term? Lots in there, Anna Michelle. Before I turn to you both, actually, Anna Michelle and Tom, and apologies to everyone who's listening in and watching in. Susanna, our third MEP, keeps trying clearly and keeps appearing and then disappearing again. Never work with technology, children or animals, I'm told. So before, Anna Michelle, I give the floor to you and Tom for comments. I just wondered whether either of you had questions for our two industry speakers that just occurred to you as you were listening. I know you've got your own views to share, but before we move on to your views, I wondered if either of you had anything anything that crops up in your mind from what the two gentlemen had said. Anna Michelle, Tom, either of you got an immediate question, a follow-up question for either of them?
Well, the one thing I would like to thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. It's been very interesting to listen to. I'm glad that things are not, on the health aspects, at least, things seem to be sort of better than in other places. What I'd like to get my head around is, let's say medium term, because nobody knows long term what's going to happen anyway. Let's say medium term. Do you have an idea if there's going to be a significant drop in the number of your employees? And I mean, do you have an idea what condition really you're going to be in like, let's say 3 months from now?
Go on then, Egil.
If I can start on that, we saw in the second half of last year a drop in demand, which was more linked to the development we've seen with increased Chinese imports, for example. So as a consequence of that, we created a plan B, which we are now implementing with some restructuring, which means plant closures and permanent loss of jobs. However, what we are doing now is that we are creating also a plan C, a plan with further restructuring, because we see, for example, that the automotive companies, which are large and important customers of ours, they seem to have a very large reduction in the demand, which at this stage they do not believe will be over this year, meaning that there will be also reduced demand in 2021. And for some of our plants, which typically are not amongst the newest and largest and most modern, this could imply permanent closures, which may take place later this year. Some might happen even in 3 months, but we try to not take rushed decisions. But this is such a big change to the fundamental demand picture that we also ignore it.
I mean, I think really interesting there, Egil. Javier, I don't know if you want to come in, but I mean, reflecting on that, you go back to the demand element, don't you? And the downstream of you, the customer, the end users, whether it's automotive, aerospace, buildings, any of these big customers are the things. And it also strikes me, and Egil put it really well about, I think, about there being so much fear out there. It strikes
about what? Sorry.
Sorry, Javier.
No, I couldn't hear you. Your last sentence. Sorry.
I was just saying my last. So one point was on demand, clearly stimulating demand on the customer side, the automotive, the aerospace, the buildings, those kind of big sectors. But it also struck me that the consumer confidence piece, right? I think Egil said, there's a lot of fear out there at the moment. It seems fear about health, but also fear about uncertainty, job uncertainty, economic uncertainty, and that's what affects demand. But Javier, did you want to come in on that from your perspective before I hand over to Anna, Michelle, and Tom to give their views?
Yeah, regarding Anna Michelle's question, we don't anticipate any loss of jobs in the next 3 months or beyond. Not at all. In terms of the confidence, I'm hoping that there will be two steps to gain for the population, to gain investors, consumers, to gain confidence, and be what I call the first rebound, which will be when, if and when all the countries in Europe and the rest of the world will have the pandemic under control. Very few cases or none, and very few deaths or none. And the second big rebound, of course, will be when vaccination will be available. These two rebounds, I think, the first one will be moderate, and the second one will be, in my opinion, tremendous. It will be a wave of consumption, investments, even traveling. I think things will change for the better. Not regarding the current situation, that's obvious, but even regarding our previous situation we were in. So I'm very hopeful that these two rebounds, first one will hopefully be very soon, and second one, unfortunately, apparently, wouldn't take place till the end of the year or beginning of next year. But in any case, we don't anticipate any loss of jobs, and on the contrary, we do contemplate, and we are developing a circular economy project that would create direct, indirect, induced jobs in Huelva, and we're very enthusiastic about it, very excited. So we hope to be able to go ahead with it and stay stable and growing.
Anna Michelle, Susanna, great to have you join us. I hope you can hear us. I know you've been trying. We're just at the point where we're going to allow each of our MEP guests to at least have a few minutes for their thoughts. Anna Michelle, do you want to kick us off with thoughts that you have?
I'm not able to hear you. It's the line is very, very bad. I will try again. So
try again and listen in. Hopefully you'll be able to catch what the conversation.
Because it's cutting.
You'll go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're perfect.
Okay, that's good. All right. In my few minutes, thank you again for including me in the panel. Okay, this is how I'm going to try and get my head around what's going on. I mean, already the China was a big problem. I mean, already the industry was between, let's say, a rock and a hard place. So the question is now, what has the way the pandemic is influencing policy making in the European Union, what does that do for you, and how can you position yourself best, and how can I as a legislator understand how these policies need to be shaped in order to first keep the industry alive, and second keep it going in the right direction. So I think there's three aspects to this. One is we're talking about what's going to happen in trade policy, what's going to happen in industrial policy, and what's going to happen in competition policy. And so I'll tell you how I see these three policies and the arguments that need to be made on behalf of your industry in order to make sure that you are included in all of these and have the maximum, let's say, benefits. So let's start with trade policy. I mean, the new buzzword is, and this is what the commissioner has been telling us in the committee, and this is what we're discussing. We're discussing the concept of strategic autonomy. And we're also discussing diversification of supply chains. I think it's become clear in this pandemic that we're all connected. None of us, however, things are starting to collapse for all of us. It's clearly, I think, unattainable to say that Europe will ever be self-sufficient. So this is why we're talking about strategic autonomy. So the first arguments are about why your industry is important for Europe to have strategic autonomy. These need to be the vocal points. This is why I'm asking about employment. This is why I'm asking about how you contribute to the value chains. Then we come to the value chains, diversification of supply. This is why we in the trade policy are going to want to move away from relying on China so much and want to have other agreements, which will make it easier for you also to diversify supply chains, which will then contribute in turn to strategic autonomy. So we're also in industrial policy. Yesterday, I hosted a panel on my MEPcast series where we discussed the issue of industrial policy with the Commission and also with a representative from Mytilineos. So we had a chance to hear from the Commission, and the Commission representative said that our first goal is to save industry. That's good. Now, frankly, with the way you're describing the situation, it doesn't seem like there's imminent peril, let's put it that way. There's industries that are in much worse situation. I don't know how the things are going to be in 2 months from now if there's no demand, because at least your industry until now had the increasing demand, which was good. Now demand is decreasing. That's clearly a factor that's influencing you. But when the new buzzword in industrial policy are these industrial ecosystems, whatever that means. And there's 14 of them that the commissioner is supposedly going to include in industrial policy. I'm no wiser from speaking to the commission yesterday as to what those ecosystems are, but clearly you need as industry to be involved in this discussion in order to make sure that you're included in these ecosystems, because those are going to be the ones that are going to get supported also for the goal of strategic autonomy. I think there's some very good arguments in your case for reshoring activities and for supporting industry in Europe. And those arguments are also very strong from the perspective of the carbon footprint, which is so much larger in China. So by reshoring, we can actually be, and this is the argument that should be made to the Commission constantly, yes, Green Deal, yes, these targets, but look at it geopolitically. If by producing in Europe, we can do both at the same time, which is reduce the carbon emissions, then why don't we go ahead and do it? That, I think, is going to be one of the strongest arguments that was put very nicely yesterday. And then I come to close with competition policy. And here, I think what the focus needs to be on making sure that there's a level playing field on a global basis. So this means we clearly need to protect our industry. That means we need to screen investments, and that also means, except for funding, we need to provide the industry with the maximum amount of flexibility in how they adhere to the rules. And I think one of the things that has come up, and one of the myths that has tumbled, is that the EU cannot be more flexible on its rules. I mean, in the past month, a number of rules have just gone down the tubes. So clearly, if we want to be flexible, we can be flexible. So this is the time, I think, to be much bolder in revamping industrial strategy and revamping industrial policy, competition policy, and trade policy in order to ensure that Europe is at the forefront and that your industry plays a leading role. So I'll start with that.
Yeah, Anna Michelle, was great, and I think you're a really interesting observation from you. I mean, certainly some of the noises out of the Commission have been more along the lines of this just reinforces the need to carry on what we were doing, but just with more vigour. But it's interesting you've found some nuances there in terms of the focus on save industry first, but also the more openness to think about competition policy evolving. I know we've been having those kind of discussions in the last few years in town about how competition policy might evolve. It seems to be, from what you were saying, that actually this crisis has kind of given renewed impetus to those of us who were arguing that competition policy, trade policy needed to evolve in a different way. I'm going to, Tom, you've been very patiently sat there listening. I know when we did our preparatory call, you said you were here to listen, and we've given you that opportunity, but we should probably give you the opportunity to talk as well. And I suppose we've heard a little bit from different parts of Europe. We've heard, Egil's up there in Norway, looking out from a kind of Nordic perspective on Europe, across Europe. We've got Javier down, Anna in Greece. You're in the Netherlands. Very different situation, but also so interesting. Any views you had on the conversation? And then we'll hopefully spend a few minutes having a bit more of a conversation on some of the points that have come up. But maybe a few points from you, Tom.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, James, and thank you for the organization for having me, and definitely for having this discussion, because I really think that also for us politicians at this moment, it's really helpful and valuable to hear from the feet on the ground what is going on, what the big topics, what the challenges are, and what your views on the future are. So that's very valuable for me. Anna Michelle already raised a lot of points that I can agree on, which is not a surprise as we're from the same political family. But from the industry part, which I'm responsible for, just some brief topics, and then let's give the floor back to the participants. Obviously, the whole industry the metal industry is of great importance to the EU, and not only in jobs and being the basis of many sectors, but also due to their importance in achieving ambitions in the Green Deal, with the production of batteries, etc. I don't need to explain you that. So for me, and a question I want to pose also to the audience is, what happens with your innovation capacity at the moment? What happens with your R&D budgets? How do you see that in the medium term? Also, because if I look at strategic autonomy, that's an important topic now, buzzword indeed, on the table. Strategic autonomy will be key, and of course, the discussion will be about how can we diversify supply routes, how can we bring value chains back to Europe, etc. But at the same time, if we continue innovating, we also make sure that other parts of the world are dependent on us, and that is also incredibly important for strategic autonomy. So that's why I brought up that question. On the demand side, yes, we need to look into ways to make sure automotive gets going again. Buildings, renovation schemes, e-mobility, indeed, infrastructure, very important, and it's incredibly important that the recovery plan make sure that we stimulate those sectors so we can increase the demand again. And this is the terrain of Anna Michelle, so I will be, I'm a bit hesitant to say this, but of course we need to look into how can we defend our industries on this global level, looking at trade defense mechanisms, of which innovation is one, I think, to make sure that others are also dependent on us, but also to protect our industries, and especially because if we demand you to produce more sustainable, you need to be able to compete on the global market where those demands are not the same. So that's incredibly important. Also looking at the Green Deal. Well, let's leave it at that. And I'm looking forward to the views of the participants and of industry. Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's just kick off, because you got a specific question there about innovation and R&D, and working with the metals sector, and many of the people on this call listening in and watching in. I mean, what really strikes me is that you mentioned batteries, and I'm sure we have people from the nickel industry, the cobalt industry, and others who are listening in. You know, that kind of enabling quality that many of the metals have for some of those innovations in those 14 different areas that Anna Michelle mentioned. You can probably go through many of them and say, if you don't have metal, you don't do that. And that's certainly the case for batteries, you mentioned, Tom. So I am interested in that. I turn to both of our industry speakers. You know, how is this COVID crisis and the challenges that you faced, to ask Tom's question again, how is it impacting the focus on innovation and R&D? Has that stopped? Do you see a short-term impact on it? Do you see a long-term impact on your capacity to innovate and be ahead of the curve? Who wants to pick me up on that? Egil, it looks like you're ready. Yeah.
Well, we've had that discussion actually, and some people have argued that we need also to cut R&D at this stage, but so far we have decided not to do it. Because clearly we know that cutting R&D during a crisis is often the same as shooting yourself in the foot. That being said, though, you know, if this drags on and if we have, you know, large deficits over time, clearly this is going to have an impact also on R&D, but we try to postpone that as long as possible.
Okay. Javier, innovation?
Well, I think it is something that is absolutely indispensable. We are enjoying today what we've done for the last, for example, 20, 15 years. In the last 15 years, we've reduced our unit consumption of energy in 40%. We've become the most efficient smelter in the world, copper smelter in the world, and by innovation. So it is our people. It was our people who did it. Always innovating, finding new ways to do things, and we won't stop it. Even this project that I was talking about of circular economy, in a big way, is innovative. It deals with the treatment of e-waste. E-waste is produced in an amount of 50 million tons in the whole world, and only 20% is recollected and treated. So there is an enormous potential for doing two things. One is becoming more sustainable, the whole world, any country in Europe. And second, actually I said two, three. Second, to be less dependent on some materials that are not abundant in Europe, such as precious metals. And third, to create margin, to generate more jobs, more wealth, and promote social development. Yeah. So it's at least a threefold and all is attached to and a consequence to innovation, of innovation. So we'll never stop, or if at all possible, try to boost it and to ask the public sector for more help, more incentives, and the whole of Europe, the EIP. I think, like I said, I think it was, and it is a success story, and should be nothing bad and reinforced.
Thanks, Javier. I mean, interesting on the circular economy there and innovation within that, you know, and whether this current crisis kind of reinforces the need to create a circular economy in Europe and the innovation that comes with it. I know that's a big thing that many of the people that are listening in are getting behind, and the metal sector in particular has a kind of a key role to play, and is already in some areas, I think, of our lead battery recycling programs, very, very much at the forefront of circularity. Hopefully more to come, and perhaps gives us competitive advantage. I've got some questions from the floor, or from the European Union, I suppose, because people are all dotted around Europe, and I kind of wanted to perhaps cut in to the question of China and that global competition element. So I have a question which is from the floor, which says China is starting its recovery. how worried should we be about further dumping onto the European market? And given that, how can we be stronger without being protectionist? And I think that's a kind of interesting question, because the two gentlemen we have, I'm guessing, not only are based in Europe, but are part of global organisations. And I think Javier started out in talking about how the fact that he was selling also to countries outside of Europe. So there's a kind of double-edged sword there. You know, how do we make sure that Europe is strong and we do protect our industry without necessarily damaging the global economy as a whole? I turn, Anna Michelle, that sounds like a question for you, actually. What's your view on that? Because we can be strong, we're being strong here. We talked about trade defence, potentially Tom mentioned, but do we risk creating walls which others will also follow if we react wrongly to this?
Well, you know, I was on the side of that we weren't being protectionist enough in the past. So, I mean, obviously, I think that this should be, if anything, should push us in a new direction of reassessing what protectionist means. I mean, strategic autonomy has an element of protection in it. And I think that it's a different thing. It's a different thing to talk about free trade and protectionism when everybody's playing by the rules, and it's a different thing when people are not playing by the rules. And China is not playing by the rules. And if we see any indication that this is going to get worse, I mean, if this stockpiling is going on, and which I heard, and I don't have personally evidence of this, but I'm sure that industry knows what's going on, I think that's all the more reason for us to take action. Just like we're increasing our level of protection against investments, foreign investments, which are going to take over strategic industries. We have the same reason and interest to protect ourselves from additional dumping.
Okay. We have, there is, with 5-10 minutes left. So I just want to move us on from the China bit, which I think we've covered in different comments, and the global element. I just want to take us a little bit closer to home. So Tom, you're sat in the Netherlands, very close to the Belgian border, and I'm guessing quite close to the German border as well. And I suppose one of the things that we've seen, and one of the things that we sort of champion in our economic model, is that internal market element. And as we've come into this crisis, internal market is kind of, you know, there have been barriers. We've seen face masks not moving between countries, for example. You know, labour movement, I'm guessing some of the people on the call might have problems in terms of staff that could travel between different countries, especially in border regions. Goods, are they getting through in time? All of those kind of things. What risks do you see from a kind of internal market perspective as we start to reopen? You know, are there things that you worry about from a political standpoint? I'll let the industry guys come in, or are we happy that the internal market is going to be protected completely?
Well, James, you're absolutely right that in the beginning of this crisis, the internal market kind of collapsed for some days. And I'm glad that the European Commission tried as fast as possible to have these green lanes going. But yeah, there were lines at the border. Products didn't move borders, and especially the medical equipment exports bans is something that in one European Union we shouldn't be happy with. So that's indeed true. I also see, when I look at industry, the differences in whether it is stated a vital industry in one country and it is not in another country. That comes with problems as well. So I think that are truly lessons we need to learn from this. And also, for example, people not being able to go from one country to another to work in factories and to keep these businesses going, because that's what we're talking about, is something we should make sure that doesn't happen in the future anymore. There's just one thing I want to add to that, and that is that I don't believe that much more power for the European Union in these times of crisis, when it comes to measures in crisis, is important. Because if one thing we learn is that people need to listen to the measures and react to that. They need to stay in home. They need to not go on the street, etc. And if that signal would come from Brussels, I'm not sure whether people would listen as well as they do at the moment. So that's still a nuance I would like to give in this discussion, which is not for an industry, but is important in the discussion.
Okay. Just allow any of the industry guys to come in on that. Have you faced any kind of internal market issues in terms of within your own organisations?
I think Tom's description is very correct. We had that for a few days, but since then it's been working well, because we have a number of plants on the borders between France and Germany, for example, close to Strasbourg and other borders. And now employees are able to pass having documentation that they work in a different country. So the key flows for us are working well inside Europe. So thanks to the European Union for sorting out that one. That's at least our view.
So we hopefully be prepared for the next time this happens, given that. Just moving us on, therefore, I just wanted to pick up on something that hasn't been really discussed or not mentioned by any of you, which is, there is a view here that I think in Brussels, or at least in chatter, about, that this should kind of reinforce Green Deal, and those Green Deal measures should be sped up and made bigger. And certainly we talked about the need for creating demand, so I'm not going to go there in terms of the money and getting demand into key sectors. I think that's pretty much clear, we're all agreed. But one area where there seems to be some disagreement is whether there should be pauses for industry in the short term on regulation, whether that's climate or environment or other measures. I'd be interested to hear, two EPP members, what's your kind of sense of that from, I've seen the automotive guys ask for pauses. I think I saw the plastics converters ask for pauses the other day in single-use plastics. I'm not sure I've heard the metal industry call for it, but I'm interested in your kind of reaction to those calls, Anna Michelle. Do you have sympathy for calls in pauses for regulation at this time?
I have sympathy for flexibility in the short term in order to deal with exigent circumstances, and we're certainly facing those. But strategically, not just, I don't have sympathy for industry that claims that is using the pandemic as an excuse to try and loosen rules that, that were just and fair. But yes, if we need to be flexible in the short term to keep us alive industrially or financially until we figure things out, I do. And then I'm always in favor of revisiting regulations and, in order to take into account new circumstances. But again, on the basis of fact and real need, not exploitation.
So Tom, you mentioned automotive in your comments and the need to get demand back for automotive. How much sympathy do you have for, say, tying aid to the automotive sector to that sector producing more electric vehicles? Would you tie the short-term financial support to Green Deal principles, let's say, if you were the Commission?
I wouldn't make it hard demands when we're talking about making sure that business survive. I would say that if we use taxpayer money, that you can have a proper conversation about the future of different sectors, definitely. But at the moment, and Anna Michelle stated that very correctly, we need to look at facts and figures, and we need to make sure that we provide the flexibility where needed, have the good conversations on the future of industries. But it's crisis at the moment. It's definitely a crisis, and we shouldn't shoot ourselves in the foot, both on one hand on increasing demands where it's not possible, but secondly also, as already mentioned by industry, the Green Deal is also a way to come better out of this crisis, which we should also not forget. So we need to strike the right balance and be flexible where needed, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I realise I've reached my hour, and that was our schedule. I'm sure people are rushing to get onto the next webinar/conference call. So I just wanted to give you all just one last opportunity, okay, to give a key message to the people on the call, but perhaps also a key takeaway for those that are not on the call as well. So I'm interested, the Commission yesterday was discussing powering the recovery plan for Europe, or at least the lead draft that I had, their discussion document seemed to suggest that. If you were advising the Commission and its infinite wisdom to do one thing in the next month to help us restart the economy, and the metals industry a part of that, what would be the one thing that you would ask the Commission President to do? So who am I going to start with? Anna Michelle looks like she always has the right answer. So Anna Michelle, I'll start with you. What's the one thing? Ladies first. Anna Michelle, you first, and then I'll go.
The one thing in general about the crisis, or about industry? Are we in your industry now, or are we in?
Well, no, you could say no. Broader than that. What do you think?
You want an overall, the one thing
one thing that they should do to restart the economy, Anna Michelle?
Whatever it takes.
Very good. Do whatever it takes. Javier, beat that.
I agree with whatever it takes, but specifically promote infrastructure, construction, and automotive support to the automotive industry.
Okay, very good. Egil.
Well, I'd like to say that the European industry is generally a competitive and a low emission industry. So, we support the strategy which the European Union has chosen before this crisis. Now it's about making sure that our industry remains competitive, that we are protected against unfair trade, and that appropriate demand stimulating measures are put in place. Most important thing, get the virus under control, but get the confidence back in the people. Because when they have the confidence, then demand will come back.
Yeah, let's get that confidence back. Sounds like a good call. Tom?
Yeah, if it would be one message, it would be don't be naive when it comes to our position on a global level. I think that's very, very important. And secondly, make sure you don't invent all solutions behind your desk in the Berlin Mall. But have the discussions like this with industry, because that's absolutely valuable, I think.
Yeah, I think we all hear that one, and I mean, it seems. I mean, Anna Michelle, you mentioned conversations with the Commission. It seems the Commission are opening up to industry a bit more in this usual at a senior level. So certainly from what I hear and see, so that's good. Thank you all for participating. As I say, technology. I'm glad you could eventually hear me. We could hear you. I hope that was an interesting thing for you guys to participate in. I hope that the people still on the call, it was interesting for you too. If you did enjoy this, as we said, this is the first in what will hopefully be a series. We are back on the 15th of May, and we are going to talk more broadly around European Green Deal issues. We have these coming up. Thanks for your time. Please do stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you in person in the near future. Keep the faith. We'll get there. Okay? Take care. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.